Now, where we left off, we looked at the J and E sources and tried not just to say, well, look, this text is J or this is E, it says this name of God, or that sort of thing, but to look at the real evidence for identifying the different sources and then to place them in history and understand how that happened so that you get a J and an E because you've got a Judah and an Israel, and in each one they produced a different text. And you get a combined work, RJE, which reads almost complete without a break. And that also reflects history. The merging of Judah and Israel into just Judah is also what merged those two into one story. And then we looked at it from the point of view of a priest in Jerusalem. You're an Aaronid priest, and here's this text that reflects a lot of things from Mushite priests. It makes Moses the good one. It makes Aaron the bad one. So this Aaronid priest writes a new version where Aaron is also a good one. And Moses isn't exactly bad, but he does kind of hit the rock and get in a lot of trouble and get Aaron in trouble. And his wife isn't mentioned, but it turns out Midianite women are bad in the priestly source. And so what happens is if you start going through all of these qualities of the priestly text, P, you see them too coming out of the history of what was going on at the time. So part of this hypothesis that makes it so strong and also makes it interesting is it shows how much the birth of the Bible was associated with the history of what was going on in the world at the time. So, for example, let's look at various aspects of P and tie them to that, and then we'll go to the fourth, the deuteronomistic source, which we have not discussed yet. In the priestly source, one of the things I noticed is that there are no sacrifices at all in the story, all through Genesis. In P, there's none. And all through Exodus, there's none, until you get to the last chapter of Exodus. In Exodus 40, there's the first time that there's a story of a sacrifice. And what happens in Exodus 40? It's the dedication of Aaron as the high priest of Israel. So if you could go up to the author of the priestly text and say, wait a minute, are you saying that nobody on earth ever offered a sacrifice until Aaron was made the high priest of Israel? I don't know what that person would answer. I don't think he'd claim that. But the point is, in his story, he's not going to put it there. He is only picturing sacrifice once Aaron is the high priest. And that will impact on all kinds of things. So, for example, I said, if you look at the parallel of the RJE version and the P version, in the RJE version is the story of Cain and Abel, the first fratricide. And it's over a sacrifice that remember, Abel's sacrifice is pleasing to God, whatever that means, and Cain's is not. Well, P doesn't tell that story because there's a sacrifice in the middle of the story, so it's just not there. In the J version of the story of Noah's Ark, the first thing Noah does after he gets off the ark is offer a sacrifice. In the priestly version, there is no sacrifice at the end of the story. Noah can't do that because Aaron's not born yet. In the E story, there's a story of the sacrifice of Isaac. In the priestly version, there is no sacrifice of Isaac. That whole story is just left out. In the story of Abraham's covenant with God, the Abrahamic covenant is told twice. It's in Genesis 15, which is a J mixed version, and in Genesis 17, which is a P, a priestly version. In the J version, remember there's this strange thing that happens where Abraham does this strange kind of sacrifice. He cuts a bunch of animals in half, and he lays the parts of the animals, like right side of the cow, left side of the cow, right side of the sheep, left side of the sheep. And he divides them all, and God, apparently, or something representing God in the form of a fiery torch, passes in between the parts. In the priestly version, there's none of that. God just talks to Abraham, and they conclude a covenant without any sacrifice. In the flood story, in the J version, we have that business where there's a distinction between the clean and the unclean animals, and you've got extras of the clean, the sacrificable, edible animals. So in the J version, there are 7 pairs of sheep, 7 pairs of cows, and 7 pairs of antelopes, 7 pairs of giraffes. So there's 14 of all the clean animals. but there's only 2 each of lions and tigers and bears. I count on that. And in the priestly version, there's just 2 each. No regard for that. Why? Because in J, the first thing Noah does when he gets off the ark is he offers a sacrifice. So he needs extra sheep. If he has only 2 and he sacrifices one of them, no sheep. So in the priestly version, he doesn't have to deal with that because he's not going to have extras, therefore he has only 2 of each. And that's what it says, by the way. And it's 2 of each, and then people read that as the 2 by 2, which is just wrong. What else? In P, there are no stories of angels. The word angel just never occurs. When it tells the story of Jacob having his name changed to Israel, in the priestly version, God just does it. He just tells him that, and there's no angel in the story. In the P version, there are no dreams. In the P text, there are no stories of talking animals. In the P version, there are no prophets. The word prophet never occurs, ever, except once metaphorically referring to Aaron, where God says to Moses, you will be like a god to Pharaoh, and Aaron will be your prophet. That is to say, in the priestly version, all channels to God that you saw in the J and the E version, dreams, talking animals, prophets, angels, they're not there. There's only one channel to God. You want to get to God, you go through a priest. You bring a sacrifice to the tabernacle, you talk to the priest. Nobody else. Because it's written by priests. In the priestly version, there's no references to mercy. Remember, in the J version, in Exodus 34, there's that moment where it's the closest moment a man ever has to God. It's the thing that Moses has that no other prophet does, that he sees God. And as God goes by, God says this formula, Yahweh, Yahweh, merciful and gracious God, long-forbearing, abundant in kindness, showing kindness to generations. All of that, it says like in 14 different ways that God is merciful. It does not at all emphasize the just, disciplining side of God. It doesn't mention anything about the wrath of God or any of that. The main formula of God is how merciful, forgiving, and compassionate he is. All of those words that occur there in Hebrew, El Kanun, Rachum, Erchapayim, all the words, Chesed, the words that mean kindness, compassion, mercy, all of those never occur in P, in the priestly source. He pictures God more as just. You get what you deserve, not that God is merciful. Now, if you would walk up to the author of this text and say, wait a minute, you know, I was reading through your book and I kind of noticed you never mentioned any words for mercy. Do you think God is not merciful? I expect, guessing, that he said, no, God is merciful, yeah, sure. But that's not how he's presenting God in his story. He's emphasizing the other side, which is if you want to be forgiven, the emphasis is not that God is merciful and will forgive any sin and all that. Mercy is free. He's a priest. If you want to be forgiven, you've got to bring one goat. You've got to bring a sacrifice, which goes to the priest. Now, I don't mean that as cynically as it sounds. I mean, a lot of people say religion is just about money, and that's not true. I mean, the money, I mean, the support of a church or a synagogue, a temple, or whatever it's a reality. It's a necessity, or else they don't exist. You know, I mean, the priest has to eat too. You know, so that I'm okay about that part. But the point is that an author telling it is emphasizing that part, the support of the priesthood and the tabernacle and the religious establishment. And the other side is, merciful, saying God is merciful and forgiving and all, because they're like either country priests or non-priests, or they're people who don't have a stake in it like that. Stake, that was a pun, actually. There used to be a commercial for a leather sofa company in California, and it was this cow talking to you. And he says, if you don't buy a leather sofa from them, it's no skin off my back. Like, you know, our prices are utterly ridiculous. You know, stuff like that. It was very in American sitcoms, disproportionately, there have been people who are advertising people for a living. You know? The husband in Bewitched and the guys in, several different television programs of American history. For some reason, they're disproportionately advertising people. And they're a different kind of person. With no offense if any of your fathers or mothers are advertising people, if you aspire to be an advertising person. But they're special. The guy who came up with Flo, you know, or the Aflac duck, or, you know, eat more chicken. That was good. That was a smart one, you know. Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you care? We'll put out ads for this course next year and see if I get higher enrollments, you know. The Bible, you know. I came back to the Bible, you know, and we all... We'll have to bring sex into the ad somewhere, you know. I'll be in a bar, and there'll be beautiful women, and you know, something. So the stories of the priestly work also favor the Aaronid priests. So they have a story where there's this man, Korach. Korach challenges Moses and Aaron for the priesthood, and you know the challenge fails, and Korach and his people offer incense, and they all get burned up and destroyed. And in fact, in the excavations of Israel, there were excavations at the city of Arad. Arad is a place down in the southern part of Judah. It's in that desert area today. And they discovered a Jewish temple there from the biblical period. Now, there isn't supposed to be, because you all know the big law in P and in D is centralization. You're only supposed to worship God at the central place. But in fact, the Jews had there was a temple at Arad, and in the excavations of it, we found a reference to the Bnei Korach, the sons of Korach there. And so they apparently were in competition. So in the story, Korach is pictured as the first cousin of Moses and Aaron, and he challenges them for priesthood, and he loses. Presumably, that's an Aaronid priestly polemic against, you know, people who are out there. Were you asking a question?
Yeah, but then like synagogues earlier on, like in the first century, like what we had at Capernaum in Greece, like those don't directly defy that law.
No. First of all through the whole biblical period, there isn't even a word for synagogue. They didn't exist. There's only the temple. But toward the end there, in the first couple centuries BC, there are synagogues, but you never find any evidence of an altar and sacrifice at a synagogue. That's what you can't do. You can pray wherever you want. So synagogues were for prayer, and but that was like the beginning of the change from biblical Judaism into rabbinic Judaism, where everything changed. Instead of priests, you got rabbis. Instead of temple, you got synagogues, and everything's changed. Fortunately, I just do BC, so I don't have to worry about that stuff. The little point that Judaism completely transformed after the biblical period, I don't have to deal with that little minor aspect. It's like dealing with Christianity and leaving out Protestantism. It's like, yeah, that happened. Yeah, Baptists, yeah, I think they're Christians too. It's like, just... There's the story of Phineas, where likewise it says when these people are committing this terrible offense inside the tabernacle, it says they did it in front of Moses. So Moses sees it and doesn't do anything about it. Phineas, the grandson of Aaron, goes in. He does something about it. God rewards Phineas for his zeal and gives him an eternal covenant of priesthood. And after that, only descendants of Aaron through Phineas are the priests of Israel. All the other Levites are just Levites. That becomes the rule. And then in the priestly version, it runs that backwards so that you never think of Levites as priests, even though Levites were priests all through the biblical period. but they create a new word that just means priest. And then it's understood that only descendants of Aaron are priests, and all other Levites are mere secondary clergy. And that's to this day. In Judaism, there are people who trace their roots to Levites. I mean, we're having a guy named Tom Levy lecture here. When people are named Levi or Levine, and those are presumably, in all likelihood, descended from Levites. And somebody's name is Cohen, which means priest. They're more likely, not always, to be descended from the ancient priests. Or if their last name is Aaron or Aronson. I mean, certain Jewish names reflect what your relationship was to all of this already back thousands of years. And what they did was revolutionary in saying, instead of all Levites being priests, it turns out that only descendants of Aaron are priests. And all the other Levites are going, well, I'm descended from Moses. What is that, a shabby lineage, you know? But no, they got closed out. And that was revolutionary. And when was that division between priests and Levites made? It's explicit in the book of Chronicles that it was during the reign of King Hezekiah. And that's one of the pieces of evidence why I think the priestly text is Hezekiah. Another part has to do with the tabernacle. It was a big, lengthy thing. It is one chapter of the book. It's very cool. It's something I thought of while teaching this course the first time, 30, whatever that was, years ago. That the tabernacle was standing in the first temple, and so when the priestly text keeps saying, you have to do this at the tabernacle, you have to do this at the tabernacle, it means P had to be written while there still was a tabernacle. And maybe the best evidence that the priestly sources from this earlier period is linguistic evidence. Hebrew changed over time, and in the period after the Babylonian exile, Hebrew was different. And if you read the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, the Hebrew portions there, it's a different Hebrew from the Hebrew of Samuel or Kings. And this evidence, I mean, it's more like math. I mean, it's real evidence, not based on, you know, your concept of when ancient Israel would have thought this or that. And it makes the priestly source come out early. Despite that, the majority of Bible scholars still think that this priestly source is late. It developed in the post-exilic period. It's around the time of Ezra. And that's simply contrary to the evidence. And you can't get them to argue with you about it. They will not discuss the fact that the linguistic evidence goes completely against them. And I keep saying, having a major theory about the origin of the Bible without taking into account Hebrew is like in medicine having a great new theory about diabetes and not taking into account sugar. You know, I mean, you can't do that. It's like being a cardiologist and not being interested in blood or arteries, you know. Is that enough metaphors now? Have we analogies? Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about the linguistic evidence for P?
It started with a Harvard dissertation by Robert Polzin in the early 70s, but Polzin really wrote it under the influence of the Israeli scholar Avi Hurwitz. Hurwitz is the best, and he happened to be a visiting professor at Harvard that year, so he worked with Polzin. And then Hurwitz himself published major pieces after that. And Polzin's piece was simply to establish a typology. He wasn't arguing P is first, J is first. He looked at the Hebrew of J and of E and of Deuteronomistic and P, and he found that the sources that were later in the hypothesis had more in common with the Hebrew of Ezra and Nehemiah. And the sources that were earlier in the hypothesis had more in common with early Hebrew works. And so all he wanted was a relative chronology of them. Okay, like that. And Hurwitz took it further, not distance, further than that. And he brought in exterior evidence as well. So the parts of Hebrew that look early, like J and E, and it turns out P, it's not just on a relative chronology that they're earlier than the others, but that they have more in common with early things we've found, such as inscriptions in Hebrew, that we've now found thousands of inscriptions in biblical Hebrew. And the Hebrew of those works, J and E and P, has more in common with the Hebrew of those inscriptions. The Hebrew that you find in Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther is more like the Hebrew that you find in Dead Sea Scrolls, the Mishnah, which is like 200 CE, and so on. So there are actually outside checks on all of that. I was at a meeting of, it was the Hebrew University Bible faculty in Jerusalem, and one of the scholars who insists that this was all very late, was all made up in the post-exilic period. This was Tommy Thompson, who's a professor at U of Copenhagen. And Avi Horvitz was practically emotional in asking him questions after he said, you can't ignore the whole history of Hebrew. Everything we've done, all our studies, my work, everybody's work, you can't just ignore it. It all goes against what you're saying, that you're claiming these things were written, made up late, but they're in early Hebrew. And Tommy Thompson said, and I was there, he said, now here I'm going, and he beat his chest. He said, here I'm going to have to admit, mea culpa, Avi, I haven't studied all of that. And Avi said, I'll send it to you. So Thompson said he'd get to it. 2 or 3 years later, I was giving a paper about this at a conference in the States, and Tommy Thompson was sitting in front of me in the audience, and it was like hundreds of people, and he and his colleague, Professor Lemke, also of Copenhagen, who has the same view, were sitting right in front of me. And I'd had it in my paper to say, Tommy Thompson was at a conference years ago, and he didn't take Hebrew into account, but he said he'd get to it, and now it's years later, he still hasn't gotten to it. I saw the man was sitting right in front of me, and I'm a gentleman, so I crossed out his name, and I said, a scholar I heard a couple of years ago who states these things, I said, he said, now here I'm going to have to plead mea culpa, but I will get to it. And I said, but we're still waiting. And I watched Thompson and Lemke were just sitting there kind of looking at each other and laughing. And I don't think they were laughing at me. I think they were just laughing at the whole, they were just having a good old time. I don't even know if he knew, since I didn't use his name, that I was quoting him. I've debated with scholars who date things late, with John Van Seters, who was the leading one in North America, and with Erhard Blum, who's the best on this in Germany. And we were at a big session, a conference with hundreds of people there, and they each spoke, and then it was my turn. I said, I noticed they didn't mention linguistic evidence at all. I mean, they didn't even mention it, and they're dating these things late at a time where it's a Hebrew from here, and they're dating it there. And it's like you read Shakespeare and you say, I think that's from 20th century New York. I mean, it was like that's what they're doing. And I said, you can't just not mention language, you have to address it. So I sit down, and it was like in a debating kind of format. So then they each had a chance to respond. And neither one of them mentioned language. So then I got up again. I said, look, I made a point. You can't just ignore this. It goes completely against what you say. You have to. And they each had a chance to speak again, and they pretended I hadn't said it. You can't get them to talk about it. And they're waiting, I think, for a champion, somebody who will come along and take on all the Hebrew evidence and show that it's not what Hurwitz and Polzin and those others say. What was, some of you understood that, some didn't, what Tyler was saying there. Now that is all something I deliberately left out of who wrote the Bible, because I didn't want to get into the motives of the scholars. I tried to tell it in terms of the evidence. You heard even now when I was talking about not the motives of the scholars. I do think there are dark motives, especially among the European scholars who date everything, not just P, everything, very late and made up. So I try not to go there, but it's what's known in scholarship as a predetermined idea. which is sometimes there's something in all fields. This isn't just Bible. It's science. It's in all fields. There's an idea that catches on, and everybody's on it. And then if you come along with real evidence that's a game changer, it throws them all into disarray. It ruins books they've all written already. And you really don't want that to happen. Now, there's been recent work on forgeries of inscriptions. And some of you may know there was a big trial in Israel about this. I mean, they were found not guilty, but there was some serious questions, let us say, about the manufacture of inscriptions and so on. And in Who Wrote the Bible, you know, there was only one plate. It is a photograph of the imprint of the ring of Baruch, son of Neriah, who was the scribe associated with the prophet Jeremiah. So it's very cool, since I identify him as the probable Deuteronomist. So you're looking at, you know, like the autograph of one of the authors of the Bible. This is very cool. Now, that's been in my book since 1987. The evidence is that one's a fake. And I'm sad about that, but I'm not going to ostrich my head about it. You know, do you know that ostriches don't really do that, right? You know, but it's lore. It's a predetermined idea, and so whenever I put out the next edition of the book, I will remove that photograph or put a note under it saying it certainly appears to be doubtful. Yeah, look, it's hard to say I was. Here it comes. Here it comes. Here it comes. Wrong. Yeah, it's hard to do that. Einstein, you know, had a steady state universe. And then this guy Hubble in California is watching these red shifts, noticing that the whole universe seems to be moving away from each other. And if you look out from the Earth in any direction at all, everything's moving away. And the farther away it is, the faster it's moving, which means the universe is expanding. It's considered possibly the greatest observation ever made in science. Some people have said the greatest observation made by any human about anything ever, which, that's cool. So Einstein came to Southern California, where, you know, Mount Wilson and Mount Palomar, where Hubble was doing this, and he looked at Hubble's plates and all this stuff, and he admitted he'd been mistaken. Now, that is very cool, if you can get Einstein to say, yeah, I was wrong about no less a matter than what's happening in the whole universe. That's pretty good. And, but Einstein was an honorable man, and he respected evidence. But for a lot of people, it's hard, and especially after you've written a book. After you've written a book. Einstein never wrote a book. He wrote articles. Scientists usually don't write books. They write articles. And it's very hard. And also, there is a stake that people had in this, and that Tyler started to touch on. Wellhausen, you saw in the book, in my book, is the person whose name stands out most as kind of a father of the field. And Wellhausen was a great, great scholar. He was brilliant. And his other quality was he knew how to write, which none of the other German scholars could do. Those of you who studied German, you know it's a very complex, difficult language. You can read for a whole long paragraph and then come to the verb. It's a one sentence and takes a whole paragraph and then come to the verb. I'm not making this up. And theology and technical stuff in German is really hard reading. And Wellhausen had this gift for writing. So his book, even, I mean, its title is Prolegomena to the History of Israel. It's not like Who Wrote the Bible or something. It's not a catchy title. And but that book became big, and he was famous all over Europe with that because he had this brilliant thing, and it was readable. And when he finally stopped writing about Old Testament because he said he was interfering with his students' ability to go out and become ministers, so he switched to New Testament. And he became a major New Testament scholar. And when he got tired of doing that, he became a major Quran scholar. The man was just brilliant. There's nobody today who's a scholar of all of them. There's hardly anybody left who could be a scholar of both Old and New Testament. There just aren't enough hours in a lifetime to do it. But he did it. So I give him great credit, but at the same time, the context, as you heard, was he was, you know, a 19th century Lutheran German scholar. And the two things that really got him were Judaism and Catholicism. And when he saw all this priestly stuff in the Peace Source, that just said Catholic to him. And when he saw all this legal stuff, all these laws, that just said Jewish to him. And he wrote, if you look in the introduction to the Prolegomena, he said, when I heard that Graf, who could be the Fotherfield, G-R-A-F, that Professor Graf had said that the law actually was late, all of that, it was later than the prophets. He said, I was ready to accept it almost before I heard his reasons. Did you ever hear a scholar admit such a thing? I was ready to believe this hypothesis before I heard the evidence for it. And then he presents all his evidence. Okay, he's honorable in the end. He brings his evidence. But he had this predetermined idea that anything priestly or legal, that couldn't be part of the original spiritual Isaiah, prophets pointing to Jesus. But in between came all this Jewish and Catholic stuff, all this priestly incense, sacrifices, laws, thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that. And he was a product of Paul's Christianity, where the law is fulfilled in Christ. He didn't want to hear that stuff. And that was his view, but that view came to be adopted even by most Catholic scholars, even though it was partly in an unstated hostility to them that this formed. And it's the majority of view of scholars to this day. It's hard to give all that up, but they're going to have to. I mean, my own sense of scholarship is, in the end, truth wins, because truth really is stronger than lies, because it's got stuff, it has support. And in the long run, the light side of the force really does defeat the dark side of the force, because it's got truth on its side. Now, and that's that's the first thing you've heard from me where I'm talking about a religious feeling. I mean, it's something I believe. I can't prove it. And I know that every now and then the bad guys win. I know. But, yeah.
What other sources of evidence do you have to date the priestly source? Because you referenced Shakespeare earlier. I know that Shakespeare was written, and the wording in English used in that is not actually appropriate to that period.
Right.
It's actually reflective of an older period.
Yeah.
Have people presented that as a case for evidence, and what other evidence do you have to support the dating for the priestly source?
Yeah. On the linguistic evidence, an obvious response you'd think people would make to that would be, it could be somebody later writing an older Hebrew to fake us out. So that, in fact, it is a very late period, but they're writing in Hebrew the early period. But we know they didn't do that. First of all, because if you think of the equivalent with Shakespeare, if the greatest team of Shakespeare fakes could get together, real Shakespeare scholars, and they would write, a Shakespeare play, or even a single sonnet, right? And then they'd put it under the doormat on the old parchment and so it gets nice and dirty, and then they bake it in the oven, and they do all the stuff you do. And they get it, and then you bring it to a team of Shakespeare scholars and say, this has been discovered archaeologically. We found it in Stratford under some building. We don't know what it is. And make them test it. You couldn't fool them. Good scholars would get it. And so the first thing is, I don't think they could be good enough at archaizing to do that. And so, in fact, in biblical scholarship, we distinguish between what is archaic and what is archaizing, because there are times where you can see it's somebody in a later period using an old word, like if I would be writing and I would say bodkin or something, to make it sound old. But you tell. And secondly, we know that they didn't archaize and deliberately use Old Hebrew because they didn't know Old Hebrew. How would they know to fake it? They didn't have anything in Old Hebrew. We have it because we excavated it, and we have old inscriptions. They didn't have those inscriptions. They were in the ground when this was written. If all of it is written late, then they had no early examples to copy from. So we know that didn't happen. But it is right. It's a correct approach. My other evidence for the earliness of P has to do with what's happening in the world at that time. That's when the priests and Levites get distinguished, and it's making a big point of that. And the whole business of the tabernacle, which was, I think, I know that's my contribution to this particular subject. And it's the same as with the linguistic. I can't get the other side to consider it. They pretend it's not there. Nobody's ever taken it on. One guy took it on, and he wasn't one of those late dating people. He was a good guy. He just had a thing about my tabernacle article. Now, what about the Deuteronomistic source? Here we're a little careful. You notice I keep saying the Deuteronomistic source, and we sometimes refer to it as DTR. In the early days, it just said D. Deuteronomy. But it turns out that Deuteronomy is not a work in its own right. It is part of a collection that includes Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. That it's a continuous story, and that what starts in Deuteronomy culminates at the end of 2 Kings. You saw that the last curse of Deuteronomy is to go back to Egypt, and at the end of Kings, they go back to Egypt. And Deuteronomy is very strange. It's different from the other 4 books. It's not telling the story. It's supposed to be Moses in first person looking back and making a speech in which he refers to things in the story. But when he refers back to them, it's very weird. He never refers to anything in P. He only refers to stuff in J and E. So when he talks about the rebellion, in Numbers 16 of Korach, Dathan, and Abiram, he knows about Korach and Dathan and Abiram, but he never mentions Korach, which is the P part of that. In Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, Aaron is really up there. He's like with Moses. He's involved. He's in front of Pharaoh. He's at Sinai. He's at the golden calf. He's doing all this stuff. In Deuteronomy, Aaron is only mentioned twice, once to say he died and once to say he made the golden calf. That's all you have to say for poor Aaron. So I associate this Deuteronomic material with the same guys who gave you E, the Mushite priests, the ones who don't like Aaron and the Aaronids. In Deuteronomy, you'll notice there is no distinction between priests and Levites. In those priestly texts, you're just a priest, right, if you're descended from Aaron and Eleazar and Phinehas. But in Deuteronomy, there's no such distinction. So if you look carefully, notice in Leviticus, it always says the priests and the Levites. Those words don't occur in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy, it just says the Levitical priests. The priests, the Levites. It's just one. And so it is that we understood that there's something going on. And one of the earliest observations in biblical scholarship was that there's this story, remember, in 2 Kings, where Josiah is this new young king. The year is 622 BCE. And he sends Shaphan the scribe to the temple to see how the temple repairs are going. Shaphan the scribe runs into this man named Hilkiah, who is a priest, probably the high priest. And Hilkiah says, I have found a scroll of the Torah in the house of Yahweh. And we hadn't heard those words, scroll of the Torah, since Moses gave, right? At the end of Deuteronomy 31, it says Moses wrote these words on a scroll of Torah, and he handed it to the Levites, And he said, take this scroll of the Torah and put it by the ark, and it will be as a witness there against you. And then we're supposed to understand it was there until King Josiah found it. And scribes, modern scholars rather, observed that the book that they're pulling out in the book of 2 Kings is Deuteronomy. All the things that Josiah does when he reads this book that they found are things that it says to do in Deuteronomy. And not only that, the story describing Josiah and what he did and all of that is written in the same language and terminology as Deuteronomy. And you find certain language that's really characteristic of just this Deuteronomy and that you don't find in Genesis through Numbers, which are J, E, and P. And so people call it the Deuteronomistic style. You know, I avoid using style as evidence. I admit in this case the style there at the end of Kings does look a lot like the style of the beginning of Deuteronomy and the end of Deuteronomy, but I won't use that as an argument because I just don't think style is objective enough to prove. Except mine, of course. My style is very, very characteristic of me. Actually, since my style is utterly copied from Kurt Vonnegut, it'd be interesting if someday, thousands of years from now, somebody proved that Kurt Vonnegut who wrote the Bible, you know. Or better still, you know, that I wrote Slaughterhouse-Five. I mean, now that would be cool, you know. And just for the record, since I mentioned earlier that my daughter's birthday is 11/11, that's also Kurt Vonnegut's birthday and Dostoevsky's birthday. Not too shabby. And Leonardo DiCaprio. So, but you go to Mexico and everybody's celebrating my birthday. See, that's better. Cinco de Mayo. So, though the only thing I know how to say in Spanish is una cerveza, por favor. Oh, no, I also know how to say una margarita, por favor. The two things I need in Spanish. I've managed very well, actually, in Tijuana with just those two sentences. So, what is this Deuteronomistic history thing, then? The great German scholar Martin Noth, N-O-T-H, but it's pronounced Noth, said, right, it's not just Deuteronomy. There's a Deuteronomistic history that originally was written to run Deuteronomy through 2 Kings. And there was one editor put together the whole thing. He didn't write the whole thing. He used sources in between. How else would he know what all those kings did and all that sort of thing? So he used some older texts, and he put it all together. And his main source text was at the starting point, the Deuteronomic Law Code, which just runs Deuteronomy 12 to 26. That's where there's actual laws in Deuteronomy. And that's likely to have been the book that Hilkiah brought out that day. And so he argued that that and other things were all put together, and plus a lot of writing by this person, and he wrote the whole story from Deuteronomy to 2 Kings. The other great German scholar of that period was Gerhard von Rott. All these names are in the book, so check them. You don't have to memorize all the scholars, but understand. Von Rott questioned that because in Deuteronomy there's this Davidic promise that there'll always be a descendant of David on the throne. And at the end of 2 Kings, there's no descendant of David on the throne. Everything is terrible. The whole Davidic promise has fallen apart. But he wasn't prepared to challenge Noth and say, therefore, it can't be that this was all done by one person. That challenge came from Frank Moore Cross at Harvard, who was my teacher. And Cross said, it's not possible. So he said that there were two editions of this Deuteronomistic history. He said the original one just went from Moses down to King Josiah. And that culminates in Josiah, who's very cool. They find the book. They start doing all the things it says to do in the book. He's doing this great religious reform. He's not only a new David, he's a new Moses. And everything's wonderful. But then, unfortunately, Josiah died too young. The country's devastated. the three kings and the four after him, or three of his sons and one of his grandsons, are just devastated by Babylonian and Egyptian kings and armies, and it all falls apart. So Cross said, then somebody writes a second edition to cover those last few years, and also puts in some new things at the beginning, including some curses of what will happen to show that this whole thing was a trajectory that, on which they were from the beginning. And so Cross called these two editions DTR1 and DTR2. DTR1 was the edition that goes down as far as Josiah, and DTR2 added the part between Josiah and exile at the end of 2 Kings, and then went back and put in a few extra pieces here and there in the Davidic covenant, in 2 Samuel, and in Deuteronomy itself. Supporting this view, I wrote in a dissertation under Cross that there are all these high places that keep being mentioned. All the kings you saw are being judged as being bad because they have high places. And they're mentioned in all the kings until you get to Josiah, and then they're not mentioned anymore. And then I just listed a whole bunch of other things I noticed when you read from Deuteronomy to 2 Kings. You read all these stories about all the kings and all these things that keep happening, and they all disappear right after Josiah. Whoever is writing after Josiah is changing the story. And then there's also things like, that when the book of 1 Kings has the story of Jeroboam putting up his golden calves at Dan and Bethel, he is attacked by this man of God, it says, who shows up, an unnamed prophet. The fact that he's unnamed is suspicious. And the unnamed prophet says, a king of the house of David will be born, Josiah by name, and he will do all these things. Which is pretty specific prophecy. There's hardly a more specific prophecy in the entire Bible where it gives you the name of the guy. And then what I added to support Cross's hypothesis was that there's a whole bunch of parallels between Moses and Josiah. That when Moses dies at the end, it says in the Deuteronomistic history that no prophet arose like Moses. And when Josiah dies, it says no king arose like Josiah. They're the only two people in the Bible which says none arose like him. Moses commands that you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your might. Those three, all your heart, all your soul. We can argue that that's a poor definition, but that's the famous English. I don't mean definition, I mean translation, but that's the classic translation. Only one person in the whole Bible is described as having followed God with all his heart, with all his soul, with all his might. Guess who? Josiah. Deuteronomy commands that if you have a piece of law that is too hard for you, you should go to a priest in judgment, and it's used a particular word to inquire of the priest, the Hebrew word darash. Only one king in the Bible ever does that, and it's King Josiah. When they find that book of the Torah, he goes to the prophetess Huldah, and he goes to the priest Hilkiah and does that and finds out what to do. The law of the king in Deuteronomy 17 says the king should follow this law and not turn to the right or to the left. The only person who's ever described that way, King Josiah, it says he was a good king, he did everything not turning to the right or turning to the left. It's as if you would find an ancient text, not super ancient, from George Washington time, saying, what is a good president of the United States? What would he do? He'd do this and this and this and this and this. And then you want to show that your favorite, Bush or Obama or whichever one you want, is your favorite president. You say, well, he was a good president because, look, he did this and he did this. And you'd characterize him as doing all the things that this old text said a good president should do. That's what's going on here. Josiah is being pictured as this culmination of what started with Moses. Yeah.
So like David being the one that was like the one that was given the promise, and Josiah being the one that seems like he was fully obedient. I guess we don't see any sort of covenant because within 4 generations and within 4 more kings, the southern kingdom was wiped out in 587. So I was just curious, like you said that the one that was, if you would ask, like the one that was most obedient would be Josiah. David had the problem with the Bathsheba and Uriah.
Yeah, if I asked you on a test, who, according to the Hebrew Bible, is the best king ever, You'd have to say Josiah, with Hezekiah a close second, but not David or Solomon, because they're imperfect. Now, that's not because our historian did that. The whole story of David, all of 2 Samuel, is not written by this Deuteronomistic historian. It's one of his old texts that he's using. If you look, it doesn't use all that classic Deuteronomistic language. So again, he's working with sources, and a lot of people find this the hardest part of the hypothesis. Even scholars really get this wrong, because they look at 2 Samuel and say, well, the Deuteronomist says here. And they try to trace it to the time of this or that of the Deuteronomist, and they mess up completely because they don't understand about history. That all historians in all periods, great historians, work with sources. If all of us wanted to write a history of Athens, Georgia, we weren't there when Athens, Georgia started. So the only way we could write that history is to look up sources, either secondary sources, meaning what other historians have written, or primary sources where we'd try to go through the annals and find, things that the first mayor wrote or, things like that. And that's what the Deuteronomistic historian is. He's a good historian. He's collecting sources. He is adding on his own. And that's pretty much what I'd do if I wrote a history of Athens. I'd use some stuff that's already out there, and I'd try to put it together in some logical, interesting way with my own writing. Yeah, that's pretty much what happened there. My big difference between me and my own teacher, Professor Cross, on DTR1 and DTR2 is, who is this person? The one writing at the time of Josiah, so writing this edition that we call DTR1, is, I argued in the original edition of Who Wrote the Bible that it was Jeremiah the prophet, was the most likely candidate. I received criticism for that, and I decided the criticism was correct. So here's another example. If you look at the second edition of Who Wrote the Bible, I repudiated that. I said, no, I was wrong. I don't think it was Jeremiah. I think it was very likely the scribe, Baruch, son of Neriah, who's connected with Jeremiah, but not Jeremiah himself. Jeremiah's a poet. He writes in poetry. He doesn't write in prose. Prophets are not historians. Prophets are the most opposite people in the world from historians. And so I backed off on that. But there is something going on in that when people speak of the Deuteronomistic literature, the books they're talking about are Joshua, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and Jeremiah. Now, we're not doing the prophets very much in this course, but if you would read Jeremiah, you would see a lot of those things that are the famous language of Deuteronomy occur nowhere else in the Bible except in Jeremiah. Jeremiah is the most prominent prophet during the reign of Josiah. And he's there at the beginning and the end. So when we say that there was this DTR1 edition of the history that was Moses down to Josiah, and then somebody else wrote the DTR2 edition where they extended it to the part where Jews are defeated in Babylonia, 587, the fall of the kingdom and all that. So they said, well, that was a second person who wrote very similarly to the first one, and he added on and created the second edition. And what I said is, maybe the same guy did the first and the second edition. If it was Baruch or Jeremiah or whoever it was, Jeremiah was alive at the time of DTR1, and he was alive at the time of DTR2. Baruch was alive at the time of DTR1. He was alive at the time of DTR2. That's from, DTR1 would be after Josiah does his reform, which is 622 BCE. DTR2 would be after the Babylonian destruction, which is 587. I know people didn't live as long on average then as they do now, so it's a pretty fair amount of time. That's what, 30-something years. But people live that long. I'm hoping I will. If I wrote a second, it'd be a third edition now of Who Wrote the Bible today. It's been over 25 years since the first one. I'm still alive. I hope to live long enough to do that. Yeah.
Did Moses live? How long did Moses live?
Moses is attributed to have lived 120 years, to the minute. No, really, exactly. The tradition is he died on his birthday, and that has to be correct in terms of the story, because it's God has said you can't live to be more than 120. If Moses lived one day after his 120th birthday, he's lived more than 120 years. If he dies the day before his birthday, he's only 119 when he dies. So it has to be he died exactly to the second on his birthday. It happens. People die on their birthdays. So here's Jeremiah, who's a great advocate of this Josianic reform. Here's Jeremiah, who seems to be criticizing the stuff that's in the priestly text. So I quoted this passage in Jeremiah 8:8, where he says, "How do you say we are wise and the Torah of Yahweh is with us? Behold, it was made for a lie, the lying pen of scribes." And I suggested he can't be criticizing Deuteronomy as being a lying pen of scribes. He's questioning the priestly text. And indeed, in the priestly text, it begins with, in the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth, and everything is dark, and he makes light. So everything starts out unformed and void, but then he makes light and all that sort of thing. In Jeremiah 4:23, when he's criticizing the people, Jeremiah says, "I look at the earth, and behold, it was unformed and void, and to the heavens, and they had no light." He's reversing Genesis 1, which is P. And so now we trace Jeremiah to this Mushite priesthood, not to the Aaronid priesthood. So he's somebody who's criticizing these Aaronid priests. Now you remember the last Mushite priest to be in power was the Mushite priest Aviatar. And remember when King Solomon came in, he executed all the people who had opposed him for king, but he wouldn't execute one of the high priests of Israel. So he banished Aviatar to his hometown of Anatot. So all we know is that the last Mushite priest leader we knew of is in this town of Anatot, which I wrote on the board at the time we were studying that, and I said, this will come up later. Now is later. It's coming up. And you look at the first sentence of the book of Jeremiah, and it says, "The words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, of the priests of Anatot." He's from that group. And that's further evidence that this is the group that gave you the Deuteronomistic history. Now, if that's the case, that also means then originally Deuteronomy was not part of the Torah. Right? It was Deuteronomy through 2 Kings was one work. And then there was this other work, Genesis through Numbers, that's the J, E, and P authors. Then the redactor comes along. The redactor, who I said could very well be, I think probably was, Ezra, the guy in the book of Ezra. And he comes and he wants to tell the Torah story. So he takes Deuteronomy, the first part of this Deuteronomistic history, and he attaches it to, what do you want to call it, the Tetratuch, the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And he takes the death of Moses that was in J and P at the end of, which would have come out at the end of Numbers, and he moves it. So you find, the only J and E and P you find is at the end of Deuteronomy when Moses is about to die. And he puts it in there. And he cuts that off and calls that the Torah because it's all the Moses stuff. And that's how it comes to be known as the Torah of Moses. And that's how people start to think Moses wrote the whole thing. So at the end of Deuteronomy, where Moses writes this book of the Torah and he hands it to the Levites, well, now if anybody picks up a Bible now, which is what we all do now, right? You pick up a Bible and you start reading and you come to the end of Deuteronomy and it says Moses wrote all of this scroll of the Torah. So people read that and they assumed that that meant Moses had written Genesis, that the whole thing up to then was by Moses. And that's why we had to spend all this time in the last couple hundred years doing this detective project to figure out what in the world is going on here. Who wrote this? When? How did it come together? Before we leave it then, in the last minutes, I want to do the same thing that I do in the last part of that book, which is to say that I think biblical scholars of my field, that's redundant, went too far in a certain sense, or maybe you could call it not going far enough. It was cutting it up. And a lot of people weren't comfortable with this kind of scholarship and still aren't, because it looks like it's taking the Bible apart. And it seems to me it's important then, if you recognize this, there's nothing wrong with looking at the literary history of a book and seeing how it was written, how it came together, who was involved. But then at the end, you should remember, people have been reading J for the last 2,000 years, or DTR2. They've been reading the Bible for the last 2,000 years. And you have to see, what did they get when they put the whole thing together? So, for example, one of the first things at the beginning of this course was I told you about how the snake in Eden, when he's trying to get the humans to eat from the tree, he says, if you eat from the tree, you'll be like God. Now, in Genesis 1, you learn that humans are created in the divine image. And whatever you think that means, physical, spiritual, consciousness, whatever it is, that there's something about humans that's different from what goats and giraffes have. And only a human would aspire to the divine, because only humans are in the divine image. And that works for the snake when he says to the woman, if you eat from the tree, you will be like God. That argument would not theoretically have worked on a goat, but it works on a human. So that's really brilliant how that works. But then you go, wait a minute. The creation in the divine image is P. The snake talking to the woman is J. They're two separate works. And you can't say that either author was planning, neither one of them knew they were going to get put together. And you can't say, well, then give the credit to the redactor, the guy who put them together. No, they both read complete, which means he didn't mess with either text. They just work. And that when it all comes together, you get more than the sum of its parts. You get a greater Bible because you took these different parts and put it all together. And sometimes they work so well that I'll admit it's kind of spooky, or if you like a nicer word than spooky, it's kind of religious. And I'll admit, from the very first time when I teach all this, I go like, it works so well, it's hard to explain. And my fundamentalist and Orthodox students are going, yeah, well, we can explain it. It's like, and I'm prepared to grant how quite amazing it is, how that the Bible came together, and whether you think it's by one person, all of the Torah, or several people, a total, all the parts and the editors and everybody, you're looking at something like 15 to 20 people spread out over 1,000 years. That it came together and worked that well, that's as close to miraculous as you could want. Okay.